is I want to let you in on a little secret. Okay, when I was a student, I always thought that my learning was completely dependent upon Mrs. Cassulo, or a teacher like Mrs. Cassulo, or myself. And what I wish that I would have known going into college was that really my learning came down to well, two people, but one most importantly, and that was myself. But I didn't really understand how that worked when I hit college, because when you're in college, you don't have the support that you do here in most classrooms. So what I want to introduce you to today is Mrs. Cassulo hung this up a couple weeks ago. And I don't know if you've taken time to look at it or if you can even read it from the back, but I will go over just a little bit of the concept behind it, because it addresses this idea of who is in charge of your learning. Well, there are two people in charge of your learning. There is the teacher, and then you can't read it across the top. It says the framework for teaching and the framework for learning. And so the framework for teaching is what we use to help prepare you to learn new information. The other side is the framework for learning, and that is where you are responsible for your own learning. Now you might notice that they are very similar side by side, except for one component, and that is the planning. At the very top, the planning is important. It is our responsibility to know the content that you're coming to learn, in this case math, or talking about texts. And we plan all of that, but then you have a responsibility along with us to prepare for that learning, to engage in that learning, and then to reflect on that learning. One component of the prepare is right here, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and that's where it talks about what's called author's craft. And so I want to talk and spend this day talking about author's craft, but before I get there, I want to ask you a question. On your tables or your desks are some note cards. And what I'd like you to do is we're going to do something called, and I think you're probably familiar with this from other classes, we're going to do something called the think, write, pair, share. Okay? I'm going to give you some time to think about what I want to ask you, and time to think and write on your note card. And then I would like you to, I will prompt you and say, now discuss that with your partner, and then you two will discuss the question at hand. And then we'll do a share out where we'll just get some ideas around the classroom about what some of those ideas were. So, I don't know, on your note card, if you would label this question, or you don't have to write down the question, but if you just put prepare at the top, because this is our question that's going to help us prepare for learning today. And the question is this: what approaches do you take before reading a text? Let's take another minute to now share with your, or pair up for people at your table, or your desks, and share what your thoughts were about what you do to approach reading before reading a text. Go ahead and do that now.
If it's like in an English class, you document it oftentimes you can analyze again. Whereas in most like classes, reading.
Thank you for that conversation. Let's share out. I'd like to get at least 4 responses as to what do you do to prepare. What was the question? What approach do you take before reading a question? Yeah. What? Mm-hmm.
I underline the important topics.
Okay. So before you start reading, you just start underlining.
Yeah.
Kind of, so you do a skim first. Okay. So skim and underline important topics. Did you ever get up?
I think about like why I'm reading it, so I can like pick out the answers while I'm reading it.
Okay. So why I'm reading it, giving yourself a purpose for reading. Yes.
I think about what background knowledge I have about the topic already.
Okay. What do you already know about the topic, and so how might you make some of those connections? Okay. Yes.
Reading it it really depends on like what context you're reading it in. Like in an English class, you may be reading it to analyze it, or to what's the word? I can't remember what that word was. It was like basically just kind of copying it in your own words.
Okay, annotating.
Paraphrasing?
Annotating.
Annotating, okay.
Or in other classes like history, you're often trying to memorize key points and note take.
Okay. So kind of going along and taking the idea of purpose even deeper. Am I analyzing? Am I annotating? Am I looking for facts? Things like that. Okay. I like it.
And this one.
Background knowledge.
Background
That's what it
knowledge.
was. I knew it was a biggie.
You know what I like about that? I forget who said background knowledge, but background knowledge actually up here on your responsibility for learning. That's the first thing. Think about your background knowledge of what you already know. So very well done. Thank you. Okay. Today's goal is to have you think about how you approach reading by looking at the structure of a text for what will help you to learn and what distracts you from learning. Because even though is this where we were going to look at the statistics? I
Oh.
forgot about that. Yeah, a couple weeks ago, you guys did a survey for Mrs. Cassulo, and this is kind of what prompted us to say, hey, maybe this is something we should talk about today.
Because I was like, whoa, I just assumed you would all check your answers in the back because I give you odds. But it alarmed me when almost half of you, 44% of you said, sometimes I do that. But yet 17% of you said, I never do that. And then the one that really got me was this one. There's great examples, but look at this, overwhelmingly, we had 65% of you said, sometimes I look at it, but only 13 said you always do. And then I have those 22%, not kids, that say, I never do that. So that's what prompted me to go to Mr. Gross and say, help me. I don't know how to use a textbook, help me teach them.
Okay, so author's craft is the ways that you can go about analyzing text, but Mrs. Cassulo and I thought probably the simplest is one of the best. Okay, and so we created a T-chart that has on one side things that help me learn when I look at this, and on the other side is things that complicate or clutter my learning. And so what we're going to do is we're going to first model for you how we might walk through page 204.
Complicate. There we
Okay.
go, sorry.
Complicate.
Oh, you know,
Okay.
whatever. Apparently it's not just the monster show.
Yeah.
today.
So
That complicates my learning when people misspell it.
misspell, right? Exactly. So we're going to model for you how this would look or might look, and then we'll bring you in on it. So be looking at page 204 and 205 for things that might complicate or assist you in your learning, and then we will turn you over and let you practice on your own. So I'll get it rolling. When I look at this page, when I first turned to page 204 and 205, something that complicated me right away was way too much language, way too many words on these two pages that I felt a little overwhelmed. Okay? So what can we do with this information? We've spent, now, as you practice this, you know, when you go to history class and Mr. Shermerhorn or Mr. Ream or whomever it is gives you a primary source today, you can take a second and look and say, okay, what in this helps me to learn and what helps me is hindering me. The way we use this is, I can't change the textbook, right? I can't change the font, I can't change the font size, I can't change that it's too wordy, or the math language and the examples, I can't change any of that. So what I have to be aware of is that, okay, these things complicate my learning, but I'm just going to have to overlook those things. And I'm going to have to put a focus on what does help me. Okay? So it's not being critical to saying, well, this book should be changed. Yeah, maybe it should in some instances, but we can't control that. So we just have to set those other things aside and be aware. And that's the important part of this. So I'd like, now that we've modeled it and done it together, I'd like to give you the opportunity to practice this on your own. So in reflection of the lesson that I just did with Beth Cassulo in her math class, the goal of that lesson was for students to really examine the textbook using author's craft, which is something that I feel like students don't do a lot of, is analyzing text before they read. And so the lesson was designed upon that. While creating the lesson, this is a Monday that we recorded this and did this lesson, I was a little worried about the shortened time, so when I'm looking at my reflection form, one of the things I took into account was I wasn't going to have quite as much activity as I might normally have, and actually it worked out really well. The timing was perfect. But my goal for the day was to give them a chance to see us model the author's craft using the T-chart, and then I wanted to give them a little bit of practice with us, and then finally give them practice working by themselves, and then being able to work with a partner in going through the process of analyzing author's craft in their math textbook. The point behind that was not so much, for today, it wasn't so much on math content as much as it was on the process of learning. How do they learn from that textbook, and can they take those skills that they learned today and move those skills into a social studies primary source, or into speech writing, or into reading information from a database or research or a poem or a text, all sorts of different types of texts. So we did quite a bit of teacher lecture today. It was new information, and I tried to chunk it so that there was some new information, then they had a chance to process it and do something, and then we gave them a little bit more information with the T-chart, and then we practice it, and then they had their opportunity. So there were the notes, the guided notes. We had some independent notes where they get to write down their own ideas. And so I thought that went really well. What I really thought went well in this, as I'm looking at the reflection form, was the partner activities. It was really interesting when it was a pretty quiet class to begin with, but when they were by giving them the chance to do the think and write on their own, and then they got the chance to pair up, I really felt like there were some really nice conversations between the students that then came out when we shared out. Without that opportunity to think and write, to think if I would have just said, turn to your partner and talk about author's craft or talk about what you just saw, I don't think I would have gotten quite as much if they didn't have that opportunity to write it down. So with all those instructional strategies, one that I definitely wanted to make sure I got in today was at the very end of the class, I wanted them to have an opportunity to reflect back on what they had learned today. And so the question we asked them was, how might thinking about author's craft of a text before they read help them become better learners? And we got some really good responses from students on their note cards in that reflection. So hopefully that will help the transfer of that lesson move to other classes as well. When I think about roadblocks to this lesson, probably the biggest thing would be the execution of just my directions to the students. It was the first time I taught that class. And so in reflecting back on that, I think I could have been a little bit firmer in the ways in which I directed students. I think I had everything in there. It just is a little wishy-washy at times, as it often is when we first teach something. But as far as the lesson itself, I thought it went pretty well. One thing I really hope the students walk away from this lesson with is that this is something that they'd never thought of before. Really looking at a text and kind of analyzing, how does this text help me? How does this text not help me? Because it wasn't a deep lesson. It wasn't, I wouldn't even know that I would call it a novel lesson, other than, geez, it's something that they've ever thought about before. And so that is what, I really hope that they take that from this lesson.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Beth.